Okay, thanks a lot for tuning in today. I'm going to give a little intro here because it's really important. Cristian Vogel, today's guest, is about to put on a spatial sound and music piece, but it's an overall performance. It's called the Ballad of Agnete and the Merman, and it's going to be at the Godsbanen in Aarhus, Denmark. He talks a lot about it at the end of the podcast, and I think when you hear about it, you're really going to be intrigued by what's going on. If you want to take a look at it, if you happen to be in the area and you're going to be able to go and see this, I strongly recommend it. It sounds like it's an amazing get-together of a large group of people, a lot of technologists getting involved in this thing, and it sounds amazing. So if you get a chance, you're going to want to do it. The name of the piece again is Agnete and the Merman. You can find a link to it on the show page. If you got here via iTunes, you're going to be able to see it in the comment part of the iTunes episode. In any case, enjoy this discussion with Cristian and take a look at that. It's really interesting. Okay. This week I have the great opportunity to meet someone who's introduced to me by one of the listeners that introduced me to this guy's music, and I was pretty well blown away. And so I've been listening kind of on constant turnover ever since. His name's Cristian Vogel, based out of Copenhagen, right?
Hi, Darwin. Yes,
Okay.
I'm in Copenhagen. I'm living in Copenhagen right now.
So let me say hi to you. Hi, Cristian. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So let's start off, for people who don't know your work, let's start off by giving them a brief overview of your work. What are the kinds of things that you do, and what are the areas that you're exploring right now?
I'm still very concerned with electronic music. Those are my end. The language that I'm expressing myself in is electronic sound. So I went into indie rock for a while and other forms, but I'm sort of more into it than ever at the moment, and I'm exploring I've been researching quite intensively the multi-channel work and spatial composition, primarily using a technology called wavefield synthesis and composing for multi-speaker installations. So that's mostly what I'm focusing on. But then this all implies quite a focus on the sound design aspects of music creation. So I feel that for the last, maybe some of the listeners will disagree, but I would say for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been more and more concerned with pushing the levels of sound design itself beyond simply production and into really the compositional structures that sound design can. Well, it sort of demands, if you're going to work in that way, it demands a new type of compositional thinking, and hence the push into spatialization and spatial thinking.
Sure. It's really interesting that you say that, because just recently in the podcast, I've talked to a number of people who really kind of identify sound design as being the core, their core instrument is sound design rather than any specific instrument or tool or software or whatever, right? And but it's interesting to think of this idea that the compositional structure and maybe even the physical nature of hearing the sound needs to change in order to support that kind of perspective, right?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I realized on a residency. I was awarded a residency at the ZKM in Karlsruhe.
Yeah.
At the beginning of 2016, 4 weeks, kind of artist in residence on a program called Points on the Curve, and they were working with the 4D sound system at that time, or it was part of the 4D sound system, which is a big physical structure of a spatial sound system, quite an industrial structure with lots of omni speakers embedded in a kind of a cube system. So it's a 56 channel system, and that was in residency at the ZKM, and then I was invited to come and do some weeks exploring my music on that system. And quite early on in that very privileged situation, I realized I'm in a very good position to explore spatial sound, and the sound design aspect goes right to the front. I mean, that's the way to explore it. What I found is if you work with styles and genres, and I heard some examples that they played there, and I wasn't very impressed with the lack of stylistic innovation. So here you've got a completely new way of representing sound in space.
Right.
Why start to try and use a form of expression that is stylistically not novel,
or not even attached to that kind of environment in any way, right?
I mean, I asked that question to myself. It was just a sort of standard to set for myself, because I knew that obviously the people who were trying to commercialize spatial sound or systems, that they actually seem to be all quite focused on the cinematic experience, the things that we already are quite accustomed to. Let's say the cliche of the helicopter flying around,
right?
And then there's also some inroads into DJ effects, using spatial sound as an extra effect that the DJ can do when he's about to drop the fill in. He can do a pan trajectory of the snare drum roll or something. Right. And this seems to be the current direction, probably driven by market forces, I would say. Looking back, I was lucky in that residency at the end to hear a very special concert, which was quite quickly a spatialized version of Xenakis's Occident Orient, which is a tape piece on 4 mono channels. As far as I know, that piece wasn't spatialized by Xenakis, but Paul Uman from the 4D sound system, he spatialized it for this concert evening that we all did something at, and this was the sort of opening piece. But I was really lucky to be able to hear him in an empty room with nobody there the day before, the technical rehearsal, just exploring those stems from that really rare and special tape piece. And I was just blown away by the sound design that Xenakis was doing. It's like there was nothing, I think it's from the early 70s or late 60s, but I didn't have that feeling that I get with so much contemporary electronic music, where I know the processes behind it.
Right.
So I say, this sound is a granular, not very good granular clap or something, that's an exponential reverse envelope on a white noise thing. So I didn't have any of that. Every sound was just completely immediately out there in its design and in its sheer power and aggression, and the quality I got more than anything from hearing those sounds was some type of a menace. It was a feeling of menace in the sounds.
Right.
And I thought, that's good sound design. That's the stuff we're talking about here. Completely abstract, no reference to any of the processes that I could recognize, having worked 25 years in right at the edge of sound design, and just I could tell you the tools. Sure, I knew the time the technology was around when he must have been composing that. We're talking filter banks and bandpass filters, generators. There's a lot of the stuff that's up in the Euro rack right now, but just the potency of the compositional thinking going on in the arrangement of those sounds in time, space, and the way the expression contained in their quality, the quality of the sounds themselves. So anyway, that's the stuff that I heard early on, and I thought, wow, when this is spatialized, it comes out. Whoa! You don't hear an electroacoustic piece, like you don't get so into the stylized aspect of it, like, oh well, that's electroacoustic music. What you hear is this sound design as it's supposed to be experienced. I thought, yes, I must get my stuff spatialized. How do I do it?
So given that you're not going to be able to spend your whole life in Karlsruhe, how do you work in that specialization world once you're away from that kind of research facility?
Yes, it's a very good question, because one of the, of course, the practical issue that is stopping the diversity, or has been restricting the diversity of spatial sound composition, meaning the exploration of its possible aesthetic directions and so on, is the fact that you need loads of kit. You need a bunch of speakers, a lot of pretty heavy duty processing, computational power. you need to understand some of the science of acoustics. You need to be quite precise in your setup and listening environments. Amplifiers, cabling, everything just multiplies up a lot in cost and in complication. So yes, it's a good question, because it's like, how do you compose? How do you begin to explore the interesting stuff in a way, which is the art form, right?
Right.
So how can you do that? Now, since then, I worked with that was the main priority for me, was to find out how to do this, and I started researching more about the conventions of cinema surround and 5.1, and I've worked in quadraphonic and octaphonic before. More quadraphonic than anything. I think most people go from stereo to quad at some point.
Right.
I don't know. Clubs tend to have a couple more speakers on poles, and they give you let's put some at the back and let's put some at the front, and it's quite crude and basic. But this is okay to work with. But I wanted to get more serious, so I looked at these other forms, and I've been learning that there is, for example, different panning systems and this stuff. Some of them go back quite a way into the ambisonics, higher order ambisonics, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. Right. I'm just making a comeback, in fact, due to the VR streaming of Facebook 360 and Google YouTube VR. They're all running first order ambisonics, which is quite interesting, but we might get back to that. That's from the 70s in a way. And then the other technology is, they call it VBAP, this lovely acronym. VBAP sounds like an interesting sandwich. And so there's this stuff which I've had access to with my Kyma system. I know you've in an interview with Carla Scaletti, right?
Yeah,
I think at
right,
some point.
correct.
So
Yeah,
she's much of a guru. She creates the Kyma. So I have, I think it's feedback panning in Kyma, and I know that in Max there's the very deep spat brie from your cam. I looked into this stuff. I'm not a Max user, so I couldn't explore that at all. And instead, during that research phase of how can I do this at home, I met some guys in Paris at a company called Sonic Emotion, who were trying to put a turnkey wavefield synthesis system on the market. What that means is it's a sort of black box that does all of the computation for you, so that your computer doesn't have to overheat too much doing that. Okay. They're quite clever, because they seem to have started from that point, the question you asked me. So they had already created a way of composing using OSC signals to do your trajectories and stuff, and their own visualizer. And this could be rendered on their WFS engine at the top end of an installation. So if you happen to have more than 24 speakers, or 24 speakers at least, or upwards, you can use their system to render that stuff, right, in the space. That's for quite a big budget scenario. But you can also use the same software to render down to a binaural rendering, right, or 5.1 output, or octaphonic output. So the algorithm takes the composition thinking and simply renders it into these different formats. And that will probably be what we'll see happening more and more. It probably is already happening now. I think the new version of SPAT is very much in this direction as well. Yeah. So that's how it goes now. So I've got a little 5.1, well, actually a hexagon at home, because you can have quite arbitrary shapes. And I'm working just on 6 speakers, but in WFS, because I'm using the technology for my piece.
You know, the wavefield synthesis stuff has come up in discussions in the past, but I have to admit, not really knowing anything about it. Is there sort of like a layman's quick run through of what the technology does, or is it too black boxy to even bother with?
Well, there's a lot of this field of spatial stuff is very academic and technical, and a lot of it's to do with acoustics and mathematics. So I don't know much about that level, but I can tell you just from my experience with it that it seems to, everything has its pros and cons in a way, right? So I think one of its strengths is that it can translate a lot better your compositional work at home in the studio like this, for example, into a bigger space. a bigger room into high SPL speakers. I've already done installation in Aarhus in Denmark for a couple of weeks on 24 APG speakers, quite small 5-inch speakers, and that was the proof of the pudding, if you like. My work translated really well onto that setup. Once I programmed the speaker positions and said, hey, this is where everything is, and the system computes its filters, and then the panning really feels like it's using all of the space. And the other thing that is very strong is that you can, as a listener, you can move anywhere in that space within the speaker field. So inside the speaker circle or shape, whatever, you can go and listen from one side, and what you'll have is simply a different perception of the spatial trajectories.
Okay.
Rather than the whole spatial image falling apart, which is how some of the other systems, what happens is if you get too close to one of the speakers, you just hear that speaker.
Right. That's been my experience with kind of massive multi-channel stuff, is that if you're in a sweet spot, it's amazing. Yeah. As soon as you wander off a little bit off axis, the wheels start falling off, and then it becomes, you sort of like, well, if this was in stereo, I would still be enjoying it, right?
Yeah, and then you feel a bit uncomfortable that you're not in the sweet spot.
Right. Yeah, you get it ends up being a power struggle among the listeners, right?
Are you one of these? You one of these members of the audience that likes to go right by the mixing desk at a concert?
Right.
Because that's the best sounding part of the room.
Yeah, although sometimes when I do that, I find out that the person that's running sound is probably deaf, because it sounded no better there than it did anywhere else, right? Anyway.
But the thing is, it does. You're right, and this system, the WFS system that I'm using, there's different implementations, by the way, but the one that I'm using seems to really have a very wide sweet spot. I wouldn't even call it a spot anymore. It's quite a big zone where you can have an enjoyable experience. The other thing that's quite odd, I noticed with it, is that if you walk right up to a speaker, because I've positioned the virtual source there. You program this stuff with virtual objects flying around a visualizer, and the WFS system makes it appear in the space there. So as you walk towards where you think that sound is, and you're thinking that it's coming from the speaker, or you're used to walking towards a speaker and just getting that speaker in your face, what happens is it sort of slips away from you and becomes louder, but not because you're closer to the speaker. It's louder because you're standing in the wavefront. In
the sound itself, yeah.
Yeah, you're standing in the sound, so that sound is louder for you. But then that's what's interesting, because you turn around or you try to focus your awareness towards the other side of the room where you've just come from, and you're aware that there's other sounds going on there too. So you don't get that with what I've worked with before, which is just circular panning in a way,
Right. Well, that's really interesting. So one last question on this before we continue on, but I'm really curious. You mentioned this idea of it's sort of like upscaling into. So are you saying that, like, within your 6-speaker system, you can put together functional movements, but if you go into a 56-speaker thing, that translates into just a more detailed version of the same thing?
Not detailed, but just a different version with all of the dynamics that having that many good quality speakers will bring to you, and it will get the best out of those having that many speakers in a way. Because if you just put a big pile of speakers in and feed your mono signal to all of them, you just get massive PA wall of sound, right? Which is what we all love, actually, in the conventional PA setup. That's when we say it's a good system.
The physicality of it, right?
Yeah, it's when it's like that. It's just blasting you and making you shake and all that. So you can do that too, if you're smart and you've got big sub basses. You can do that sort of stuff, because that energy really comes from the bottom end. What it really does, I think, is help you work with the room better, and work with that many speakers in a room in a better way. That's what I meant by sort of upscaling, so that you're not completely panicking when you set up the bigger installation and it sounds like everything is just resonating and booming and the things that we all normally experience at soundcheck on a stereo PA. You know, the sound check is just, or most artists will tell you that a sound check is not to check your sound; it's just to see how horrible it sounds in that in the venue. You know how whether your music is really going to sound really bad or okay,
just kind of bad.
And so that's the check. Occasionally, you get a really good experience, you know, but there's so many things that a PA must really be tuned and must be good quality, and it's very much tuned to the room, isn't it? So
right.
One of the foundational points of spatial sound, I think, is tuning it to the room. It's the spatial aspects. So a good spatial system will give you lots of tools to tune the speaker array in the room, and then you render your spatial composition on it. I heard that phrase. Instead of saying playback, these guys in Paris, they were talking about doing a rendering.
Yeah.
He's going to do his rendering tomorrow night at concert. It's done in real time, but it is basically a kind of rendering.
Well, it's an apt use of the phrase because there's so much computation going on at the point that it's being presented. That it is in real time, but it is a rendering. That's interesting. That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, and it has this little bit more ritualistic kind of touch to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. You're right.
I'm not going to play my music. I'm going to render it. We're going to do a rendering. I've been trying to drop it around with the sound technicians and stuff, and they look at me funny. So yes, I'm not ready to render yet.
Right. So one of the things I like doing in my podcast is kind of talking about how artists became what they've become, just because it really opens doors for other people to kind of get inspiration out of that, or feel like they have a chance to do it too, right? Now I'm especially curious with you because you just kind of explained the process you went through in embracing the specialization kind of stuff, right? But you're pretty well known for being a big Kyma guy, the symbolic sounds Kyma system, and I'm curious, like, how you came to embrace that, and what it is that got you to the point that all of these sort of like this concept of sound design as not only a compositional tool, but sort of like informing your compositional techniques. How did you get all of these things kind of pulled together to become the person that's putting out this amazing music?
I think, let's see, way back in the past, there was an 8-bit computer with a 6502 chip in it, all the way back, because I started programming home computers. I'm 44. I'm born in 1972, and I first got into electronic music by programming little ASCII-based sequences on my Auric 1 computer. Okay. So I must have been about 13 or 14, 12. I don't know. Nice. I can't remember. Yeah. That generation of what would you call us? I don't know.
You were hackers back when it didn't mean that you were going to jail, right?
Yeah, right. And I was doing the typing in from the computer games from magazines, and picking up techniques and tips how to do. I wanted some music in my games that I was writing, and I remember the Scandinavian guys were always putting these programs in these magazines, and that's where I saw that you could just make a string definition of a load of letters and numbers. You could go A2, 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 B3, 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 C4, 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 and then read through that and use the number as the duration and the letter as the pitch. And I was like, that's super cool. I understood that early on, and then I had loads of ways of writing music, and I was even putting in sheet score music from this simple system.
Right.
Yeah, so I got quite into the music part of the game. So I was writing. The game was pretty irrelevant, but that was really early on. So I've always had this very intuitive association between the computational aspects of music and of music. How music is a lot of specification. Some music, not all music, but some of it is specifying parameters and then exploring them over time, right? So a really basic definition of some type of music. I think that early experience is like sequences, right? Sequencing, I guess. So when I got into we were kind of waiting for technology to catch up a bit back then. But in the meantime, I played in punk bands and got into the Sex Pistols, and I was growing up in the UK. This is mid-80s, and just, general disenchanted youth. When I look back, I feel a lot of boredom just I was waiting for technology to happen, for it to just kind of happen more, because the computers were so cool, but it seemed to be very slow. I remember being one of these teenagers that just really wants to get on with it, finish school really fast. I just want to get on with this thing, because that's why I got into punk music and alternative culture, because it seemed to be a good way to a good place to kind of wait and hang around, in these in the rehearsal room and banging drums and doing feedback on guitars and all that. Then I heard acid house on the news. This was in the UK in the 80s, the Castle Morton party, which is, many think of it as sort of the critical mass point of the illegal free party movement in 1988 or something in the UK. And it was on the news, and suddenly in the media, this music and this mass gathering of people around music and acid house, and they were doing news features on it. And so I went out there on my bike, didn't really catch the core of that party, because that was quite near where I was growing up, by the way. I didn't mention it, in the Midlands in the UK. Yeah, but I just got a taste for the cultural part. I said, okay, so here's the music and the music also was real out there, the acid house. And like, yes, where is that coming from? What is that? That's nothing to do with guitars or. So I think early on that I'm really fortunate, by the way, when I tell these stories, because I'm really fortunate to have lived through a genuine cultural revolution, I think, attached to a musical form. And I think a lot of the 90s producers and the 2000 producers that came after that, how can they know what that was like? They can just hear about it, but they can't really know what it was like.
Right.
It was genuinely mind-blowing. And I remember listening to Stacker Humanoid and Acido Amigo tapes and all this stuff, and just didn't understand any of it. But I would sample it all on my Amiga and remix it.
Right.
So all the time there was this kind of computer aspect that I was working with since I was a kid. Like, how can I explore this musical form through my computer by sampling chunks and slowing it down and doing all this stuff and making it go backwards, and then try and copy the same style that they're doing, but on Pro Tracker, and just. So I got really into it, and also more and more into going to the parties and the events and hearing these sounds on PA systems, because sound system culture is a largely overlooked fact of this, that plugging a 909 and a 303 into your home speakers is one thing, that your speakers will probably blow up, right? Unless you've got some good ones. But plugging it into a PA that at that time, a lot of the PAs were designed for rock music, or the good ones were for more like dub systems, and this techno system started to emerge, which were more tuned to heavy bass and presence in the mid range, and you started to hear these new types of sound systems that are incredibly loud. And going to the big raves in the UK, I went to a few of those jungle raves, and hearing DJs like Groove Rider and Fabio and so on, and you hear massive halls absolutely slamming with bass and PA systems. So the sound system culture is very much involved in all of that too. But that's where I started to hear how amplification massively scales up the beautiful stuff going on in the electronic sound, and the people too, of course. But then after a lot of this, I got completely into it, and I'd graduated from university. I got my degree in 20th century music, by the way. I studied modernism in music.
Awesome.
I graduated in 1995 from the University of Sussex, and then I had this degree that was within 5 years was a century out of date. You know? And it really felt like that, because that's what it felt like out there on the scene when I was touring at that time. I was like, oh man, this is going to Germany and all over the place and watching the culture accelerate and the music change and change and change. And there was very little reference to the past at that point.
Right.
People weren't, I didn't really hear good tape music and all of the foundations of electronic music until quite later, actually, thanks to the internet, really, because you can hear all that early tape music and stuff now, can't you, on Spotify?
Yeah, you can. It was shocking. I mean, it used to be so hard to find, right?
It was so hard to find it. I was studying it, and I couldn't find it. I just had to read about it in books.
Right.
Try and write an essay about something I'd never heard. Like writing an essay about Stockhausen's compactor is like, well, how can I hear that?
Right. Right.
So, anyway, the sound palette was always around, and I was also quite influenced by some of the records that I did hear, like Morton Subotnick's Silver Apples of the Moon and so on. So I sampled that a lot in the early years because I was very attracted to the sounds there. Only later do I discover it's all Buchla and
right.
That's why they're awesome. But so how did I get then? I think we're about 20 years. How old am I? 25, mid-20s now. And then I went out and just toured and played and produced and played and just got caught in the wave, like so many of us early 90s pioneers, you know.
Mm-hmm.
My most intense output with the records on Trésor and so on, that was all in 92 to 97. I mean, it took like 5 years of 2 albums a year or something.
Wow.
It's very, very tracky. I recall no editing.
Oh, really? You were just literally pounding it out that quick.
Yeah, recently for Sub Rosa compilation, the Sub Rosa label in Brussels,
mm-hmm.
they wanted to work with me on the recovering my archive material from the 90s, which I did from DAT tapes, and it was a really nice project, actually crowdfunded. Thanks to all you fans out there, really, honestly, because I was going to throw the tapes away.
Oh my!
I'd already discarded them and left them in my mum's attic, and she was moving house, and she called me up and said, "Hey, Cristian, you know, what do you want to do with all these little tapes?" And she called me up. I was a bit depressed when she called me, actually, for one reason or another, you know. And then I said, "I'll just throw that rubbish out."
Was it a bunch of DAT tapes? You said
yeah. And she said a load of little tapes in a shoebox.
Oh dear.
I said, I know what they are. I just throw that shit out. You know, I don't care. I don't even have a tape machine anymore, whatever. And being a mum, she's so awesome. You know, mums, she sent it to me anyway. She just sent me the box through the post, all taped up. And that's where I started to look through these tapes. I'm like, oh man, some of them are still good condition. And I was in Berlin at that time, and it was relatively straightforward to go to Dub Plates and Mastering and borrow their DAT machine and so on. Mm-hmm. And I was interested by my girlfriend, and she encouraged me to say, yeah, you know, this stuff means something to some people. You should try and get it out or something. I said, okay. So I did a little crowdfunding campaign just to see what the interest was, really, to gauge the interest. And they raised quite a few thousand, which I needed to do all of the mastering. It's a lot of stuff. So that was really cool. And then I went through all the tapes. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I went through the tapes, and they were like a time capsule of the studio at that time, in that really active time, right? And wow. 2 things struck me that was really interesting listening back to those tapes. And one of them is that there would be this flow of track that was released on Absolute Time, track that was released on Absolute Time, track that was released later on the other album that came after that one, track that was released on the EP. There's no fillers on the tapes, and I know that I wasn't editing because I only had an Amiga, so
right.
couldn't do it. I must have just been banging them out and really getting it all down in one take. So very nice workflow, just hands on, know how to start, know how to stop, somehow that seems to be a challenge these days, doesn't it, with the modular?
Yeah, it does. Well, I mean, just frankly, too, though, it's also the DAW or recording systems of whatever ilk you talk about now. The ability to obsess makes it so that it seems like you have to obsess, otherwise you're somehow not doing the work, right? So like now we're in a point where obsessive editing is just considered part of the game, and it's so interesting to think of. You know, it's funny you mentioned this about going back and doing some tapes. I ran across a tape a couple of days ago that myself and another collaborator did. It was like one Saturday afternoon. We filled up a whole DAT tape with stuff. And I listened to it, and much like you were talking about, it's like you're listening to it, and it's like, where's the filler, or where's the dead take? And because we were sitting there doing it in real time with these hardware rigs and stuff like that, it wasn't. We were performing the whole time, and the tape happened to be rolling.
And the tape was expensive. The tape was expensive.
You bet.
You didn't just fill one up and then let's fill another one up.
Right. That's what we do with hard drives now. Go figure that, right?
So yeah, there's a lot that discipline seems to have kind of went away with the massive storage space that we've got, isn't it?
Yeah.
I still haven't got anywhere near answering your question, so I'll try and do it as like, how did I get to Kyma? So as you can imagine, it's a very, very long road of this stuff, and then releasing, and then as I got less and less active with the releasing and more fatigued with the way that the really interesting music scene went into the clubs, and the club culture became monetized, and it all became really stinky and bad and ugly, and I really ceased to feel like I wanted to soundtrack that anymore. What I see in the clubs, I didn't want to soundtrack it anymore. It's like, why my music doesn't belong there anymore? It's not what my music is trying to express. It's not hedonistic. It's not even cathartic. You know, it's like nothing like that.
Right.
There's more going on. So then I've been kind of out of the whole club scene for quite a while. And during that period, it was a big relearning and research period, and going back to basics and saying, what is it that I'm looking for? What is it that's been driving me all these years? What am I working with? What's the real material I'm working with past the machines and past the technology? And that's where I started to get into signal theory and some more philosophical aspects of what signals are and the symbolism of signals and lots of interesting stuff which we won't go into, but I kind of got back into that. And then I see what I've been working with from a holistic point of view, and then digging right down to the constancy, what's always been there, and it's been this manipulating signals, using music and exploring the complexity of what happens when you combine and you grow signals of certain types, and you start to do a sort of special construction of expressive language, and which creates music, you know. And that's something that I got to that level of understanding through using the Kyma system and studying it quite extensively.
Sure. Now, but the question I have, and this is just because of my own experience with people that kind of have made this journey, because your journey kind of going from doing like dance type music and then becoming disconnected from that as an environmental thing, and then moving towards maybe a headier, more experimental kind of thing, or whatever you want to call it. A lot of times there are some events that occur that cause that shift, right? So in a number of cases that I know, somebody was just happily going along and, you know, doing dance music, and somebody said, hey, would you score this film? And that put them in a position to think about how they do music differently, and it perpetrated a change in the way that they thought about making music, right?
Yeah.
Was there any kind of event like that, or was it just that you became uncomfortable and you wanted to try something new, and the Kyma system seemed to be a platform to do that?
I did work. I started to work in contemporary dance, scoring contemporary dance. So contemporary dance is a very interesting art form because it's closely tied to music, and it often has a philosophical grounding in embodied expressivity and the embodied intelligence, right?
Right.
And when this is combined with a certain form of music intelligence or musical intelligence, you get this beautiful hybrid performative thing, like a staged thing. They call it contemporary dance, but whether it's more dance or more music, it's difficult to tell. Different pieces are very different. I got into that whole world for a bit, but for 6 years, 7 years, and that's where my music started to get free of the need to keep people drinking in the club.
Right.
I don't know, whatever it was they use music for these days. Keep people paying for beer, whatever. And it was a completely different scenario, and it meant that I had interesting audiences coming, people who would never come to any of my concerts. They come and sit down and just exposed to my music design, whilst keeping their eyes and their visual aspect is entertained by is engaged by all of the spatial aspects of the choreography, but then they're also receiving my music, and usually very good sound systems, very dynamic. I can be quiet and loud and detailed and intense because the systems are in these theaters, with the soft plush in the theaters. Right?
Well, not only that, but the audience is quiet. They're not drinking and carrying on conversations and trying to dance. It's interesting that you say that, because to me, I had the chance maybe 5 or 6 years ago to start working with a contemporary dance company, and I found it amazing because I had never really thought of it as sort of an extreme version of the concept of multimedia, right? I mean, it is pervasively multimedia because there's these visual things happening, there's these sonic things happening, and it's not only the sounds that I might put on the stage, but also the dancers make sound when they're performing as well, and so then that gets encapsulated into a very present feeling, right?
Yeah. It's a really special laboratory to explore aesthetics and art, or the lack of aesthetics, whatever you want to explore,
Right.
But more than anything, I got out of that, it gave me the chance to experience what my music can do when it's removed from the audience I'd been having to work with for
the club scene, right?
The club scene, like, I don't know, my whole life of touring. I was never really given any chance to experience my music in any other context. As you mentioned an example of somebody with a film, but I still haven't composed for cinema. I haven't worked for cinema. I don't know about that, but definitely in dance, that was something there. And I left that also. I left it and that's where Kyma got very strong, by the way, during that. The way to design sound in real time whilst the rehearsals are going on, but at a very high quality, because I can't take my entire studio to the theatre.
Right.
So
right.
I had to take the Kyma system is exceptional in the way it sounds, but it's also quite portable. So you get to explore some really high quality sound on location.
Right.
So that's one of the periods where I got very deep with it. But then I think I left contemporary dance also, again, perhaps a little frustrated. And guess what? It's because I wanted to get back to the studio. And then I've since realized in the last quite a few years, that that's my lab. That's the laboratory where I feel I felt most looking. If I look back all the way, and I think the experiences that I'm searching for, and the moments when I've really felt like I've created a new positive thing for the world, for the universe, for this sound, this music. This is a new invention, and it's going to save the world.
Right.
The times I felt that has been in the studio, and so now I'm very, very into the significance of the studio for music. I think the recording studio is some of the greatest musical events have happened in studios, and I think studios are under threat, and we need to figure out a bit better how to make sure that the studio culture continues. Yeah. And musicians like myself we can explore stuff in the studio and not on stage in monitors, and not under the control of a choreographer or a cinema director. We have to be able to push the music in the studio. That's the place to do it.
Sure.
So I think that's where I'm at right now, and Kyma fits in nicely there, as well as the recent renaissance of analog technology, which is, I don't know if that's something you also wanted to talk about.
Yeah, we would. But before we go there, you used the word, you said that the studio is sort of like the laboratory for your work. And I think
Yeah.
it's interesting that you use that word because you also, the word lab tends to actually kind of be pervasive through a lot of your work because you also do these things called labs for the Kyma system and for
Yeah,
Kyma
that's
users,
true.
right?
I think, yeah, because, I've never been to Earcam. I've never been inside.
Uh,
It's a bit of a fantasy place to me because my professor at university, the late Jonathan Harvey, a great composer, he told me about Earcam. He said, yes, the composers there, they wear lab coats and they go through airlocks, to get to their studios to work on music. And I've always had this fantasy image of composers doing serious rocket science type stuff, and so I think perhaps for me it's a little, the lab and the whole this idea is a bit of a metaphor for, or an analogy for, hey, I'm serious about music. I've dedicated my entire life to this. When it's really hard and my Bandcamp is, I'm earning about €6 a month from my Bandcamp and no royalties from anywhere after a lifetime's work. How are you supposed to keep going? Things are really tough. I've got like no bookings and nothing like that. So I think one of the things I fall back on this year is just like very low on bookings. A lot of people are suffering from just, I don't know what's going on with the festivals and stuff. They're all playing it really safe. So it's really, really hard to make a living. And we all know that at the moment. But I think for me, and probably speaking for many others, something I fall back on is not that, oh, my music's really great entertainment. I fall back on that this is very serious work that is about progressing and pushing imagination of music and what we're capable of thinking about and what we're capable of creating. And it's very continuous creative energy and a continuous creative act. And I take that very, very seriously. So I think perhaps calling things labs and, I take it as seriously as those scientists doing medical research or something like that, Perhaps that's what it's about, something to keep you motivated.
Right. I'd like to take a little side tour here now, because you mentioned something that I think is kind of an interesting aspect of what we're seeing right now, which is sort of the reemergence of analog systems. You and I both had this time frame when we were able to affordably get analog systems. We did a lot of music with them, right? And then in order to further explore things, we went off and really explored sound design in the digital world. But now with the reemergence of modular systems and stuff, there's a really vital place to work in analog devices again. Have you jumped into that fairly heavily?
Yeah, I was a bit late to get back to it because I felt like I was doing, as you mentioned, I was doing this already before. In the mid-90s and early 90s. I've always worked with this type of signal flow with subtractive synthesis. So, it took me a while to get back into it, but I got into it through a colleague of mine who runs Thonk in the UK, and they're a DIY specialist, really. Okay. For Eurorack.
Right.
And he just sent some kits over to me and said, I think you should start to all these things that I have to put together with a soldering iron. What the hell is this, But then I got into it and I started to solder things together, and it made me look at resistors and transistors and wonder about them. What are all these things? And I got quite inspired by the flavor of the creativity going on in the Eurorack scene. And there's a lot of interesting creative ways of thinking about the same sort of circuits.
Right.
And I also like the fact that it's very sonically informed, that it's about how things sound. And this filter, it's a filter, what's the difference between that filter and the other filter?
Right.
It's different because there'll be some history attached to it, or there'll be some context, there's some background. And I think in techno music and electronic music, because it seemed to have come out of nowhere, there's quite some warm feelings coming from the fact that things have history, that circuits have a background, that they didn't come out of nowhere, that this music has got some kind of lineage and there's lots of narratives in it. and there's narratives being written and created for the future. You know, I quite like that. It's a very warm feeling in the community, what I've experienced. So that's why I'm quite into it. And I also think the new designs, the updated designs of the classics and some of the new approaches sound really, really good. And it's a good hand in hand with the digital sound world as well.
Right. So in exploring with the electronics, did you ever get the desire to actually go down and design something at the circuit level?
No. I do a lot of software design that's quite low level. I like to. It's taken me a long time to find my expression in that.
Right.
So I think to go down to translating that to circuits, I'm not sure what benefits it would bring to me, except for the sense of achievement of having done that.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I would make anything that's any more original than what's already out there. So as there's not, it would more be about the sense of achievement. But I get that sense of achievement just by putting together a DIY kit and it working.
Sure.
So yeah, I have thought about that, and if it occurs to me that something would make sense, I would try it.
Yeah, well, I have to say that just anytime you get to use a soldering iron and you don't burn yourself, you win, right?
I'm quite fast now. I did some surface mount components.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
All right, now you entered the crazy zone right there. I'll just tell you. So
I used a monocle.
No doubt you did. So our time is unfortunately up, but before we go, I want to ask. I know you've got a new piece that's going to be premiering pretty soon, right?
Right, yeah. So we started off the conversation talking about spatial sound because I'm just totally madly into it right now, seeing as I have a premiere coming up in less than 3 weeks. It's on June the 18th, 19th and 20th in Aarhus, which is the second city of Denmark. And they are also the European Capital of Culture this year. So the Aarhus 2017 Foundation commissioned this work from me. And it's been a great opportunity to explore many of the things we've talked about in this conversation and bring them all into some kind of new way for staging electronic music. New for me, and probably a flavor of new for electronic music post-club culture.
Right.
I've embraced my years working in contemporary dance, brought some of that aspect into the mix. Also, there's the spatial sound, the whole spatialization, and what this brings to an audience, how much more active it makes them. When an audience is in a spatial sound system, they're more active and engaged than when they're sitting in a cinema or a theater. They have to take it a bit more seriously and engage more than they would in the club. They are necessarily in there to listen. If they talk, they'll miss the point. They have to put some effort into the being aware of this very special setup and installation. So I tried to get all these elements together and then compose. I've been working for 18 months on a multi-channel composition, which is really exploring what's going to happen to my music. How is my music going to change with all these speakers and with all this setting, right? And I don't want to make any kind of music that I've ever made before. And I wanted to focus very much on sound design. So I've used a lot of the modular synth that I've been soldering together. I've used a lot of this for the expression in the sound design, a lot of Kyma to help me with some of the ways to distribute signals over in a spatial system, how to take, for example, a spectral resynthesis, how to separate all of the partials and spatialize them and do very interesting things like that. That's definitely the realm of Kyma. So I've tried to bring all of my expertise together in this piece. It has some staged elements as well as two performers, and it has a kind of narrative setting, which is an old Danish folk ballad called the Ballad of Agnete and the Merman, which is about an old story of very, very one-dimensional, of love to loss, and no other kind of dimensions involved in this story, about a citizen of Aarhus who runs away to live under the sea with a creature from below the ocean and has a family under the sea for many years, and then she hears the sounds of distant bells and is drawn back to the land and deserts her life. And it's a very sad story with no real happy ending. Other composers have tried to work with this story before, and Hans Christian Andersen also tried to stage it, and it hasn't really been successfully staged very well. But the reason why composers are drawn to it is because of this sound element, that it's the sound of the bell, the Aarhus bell, that takes her back and makes her gives her the intention to desert her life and desert her family and everything she knows. And I thought these themes somehow have a kind of contemporary resonance, and they have a sonic element that's quite interesting. So I found plenty to work with there. I've made quite an abstract version of it. Primarily, I'm calling it a spatial sound performance piece because it's also a music concert and it engages on many levels. So it's not a spatial sound concert where you just come in and lie down and trip out.
Right.
And neither am I interested in that. I'm interested in what happens when we're really engaged and when we're aware that we're participating in a shared experience. Like, that's one of the things I love about club culture when it's good.
Right.
Is that it's an extraordinary experience that you're sharing with all these other people. It has spatial aspects and social aspects and very strong musical emphasis. So, yeah, that's what the piece is, and been working on it, like I said, for a very long time now. I'm very excited about the staging. The other exciting part about this, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, is the sound system. I've been really fortunate to be provided with quite a lot of the speakers by the British speaker manufacturer called Funktion-One, which is quite known in the club scene for the amazing sound systems they've put in many of the club venues in Ibiza and in Berghain, of course, quite famously. It was quite interesting when they joined the project as the collaborator, because at first it was difficult for how can we get so many speakers over, and it looked like it wasn't going to work out. And suddenly I get a call from John at Funktion-One, and he's saying, you know what, space at Ibiza has closed. They've bulldozed it and they're turning it into a car park. So we're getting all our speakers back, so you might be in luck.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah, so it was literally it was literally post-clubbing culture. It's what I'm trying to do here with music. I'm trying to say electronic music must get out of the grip of the corporate club culture and the stuff that turned it bad, and we must try and evolve into a new form, and it's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging for everybody. You're not going to hear a 4/4 beat in my composition because 4/4 beats in spatial sound doesn't make sense.
Right.
Why? So anyway, I was already exploring the whole idea of I've got to bring some of the goodness from the history of club culture and try and bring it forward into this new language. And suddenly I get the call that I'm going to get all the battered speakers from the most commercial club
ever,
in the world,
right?
Ever.
Exactly.
So I'm quite excited about giving some soul back to those amazing speakers and
recycled club culture. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's going to be really, really special thing. So I hope some people can travel up to see it.
Yeah. So for people who want to find out more, where can they go to get this?
Well, there's tickets on sale now online from the theatre which we're performing it at, which is called Godsbanen, like Gods, Godsbanen. .dk. And there's also an official project page, which I'll send it to you typed out. Actually.
Yeah, we'll put that in the program notes so that people can eyeball it. I'm actually looking at it right now, and I just want to make sure that we get that information out to people. Cristian, I want to thank you so much for spending the time. This has been fantastic to get caught up, to hear what you're doing, and really seeing you continue to push yourself into the unknown realms with some of this new work. It's really fabulous to hear, and I'm excited to just see as your work progresses. Thank you so much for your time and for the discussion we had.
Oh, thanks, Darwin. It's been really, really great to talk about some of this stuff, actually, because I don't think I can't expect that anyone's going to understand even 80% of what I'm obsessed with at the moment. So I think some of your listeners will really appreciate to hear some of this stuff, because I'm sure they're going to get it.
Yeah, I agree.
So it's really, really special to be able to be given a platform to talk about some of these ideas. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, man. Well, with that, I'll let you go on with your day. Thank you so much, and bye.
Bye.
Well, there you have it. What an amazing story. So many people know of Cristian's work really just through his work on club music, and it's really amazing to see how he took that and really spun it into an amazing world of sound design. If you want to find out more, you can check it out at christianvogel.com, which is, remember there's no H in that, Cristian, CristianVogel.com. You may want to check out his Bandcamp page, or you may also want to check out the Agnete and the Merman.info, which is where there's more information about the piece and where you can also go to get tickets. With that, I'm going to leave it to it. I want to thank you so much for listening, for sharing. Our numbers have been great, but also I'm getting a lot of great feedback from all the listeners. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, shoot me an email at ddg@cycling74.com. Otherwise, I will catch you next week.